want to welcome you again to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Vayera, and we have in this Torah portion some famous narratives about the first Jew, Abraham, and particularly the last Aliyah, the seventh Aliyah, is another very problematic narrative, one that we're all familiar with. This is the famous story of the Akedah, the binding. And notice that we call this story the binding of Isaac. That's what Akedah means, rather than calling it the sacrifice of Isaac. And I think that that is very significant. But Abraham is commanded by God, take your son, your only one, the one whom you love, Isaac, and take him and offer him up as a sacrifice. This, again, is a very problematic passage because we say, what's going on here? Why, what, God is commanding Abraham to kill his own son? And what happens? It says Abraham got up early in the next morning and he goes off on a journey to carry out this commandment. You know, what happened to the Abraham that we read about earlier on in this week's Torah portion, where he argues with God to try and save the inhabitants of those wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? When Abraham is informed that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, what does he do? He says to God, what? What if there are 50 righteous people in Sodom? You're still going to destroy it? And then he proceeds, to say, well, so what if there's not 50? What if there's 5 less than 50? What if there are 45 righteous people in Sodom? Well, how about 40? 35, and finally, of course, Abraham bargains God all the way down to 10. What if there are 10 righteous people in Sodom? Interestingly enough, of course, this number 10, which should be familiar to us, and it is a curious matter. Why does Abraham stop at 10? And I think it is precisely connected to the issue of minyan, and that is that 10 is the smallest number that constitutes a community. And so it's not simply a question here of can you find a group of individuals. Look, the fact of the matter is Lot and his family are going to be rescued from Sodom. God can rescue individuals from this coming catastrophe. What Abraham is attempting to do is to save the city of Sodom. And to do that, there has to be at least a community of 10. There has to be the core of what could be a new community in Sodom of righteous people. So that's why I think Abraham gets down to 10 and doesn't go below. Because in terms of individuals, why doesn't he just say, well, what if there's 9? So you mean for what? For one less individual? But the point is, okay, God could save 9 individuals, but is he going to save the city of Sodom? For that, there has to be the core of a community, and 10 is the minimum number for that. But the reason why I bring this up at this point in discussing the Akedah is to ask the question, what happened to that Abraham? When he's told Sodom is going to be destroyed, he goes to bat for them, arguing with God. Of course, we find this to be a very important aspect of Abraham's personality, something that we think of as being somehow part of what it means to be a Jew, to argue with God for justice. Why, when Abraham is told to go sacrifice his own son, why doesn't he say anything? Why doesn't he protest? Why doesn't he say to God, what do you mean, sacrifice my son? No, instead he simply proceeds. He gets up early in the morning in order to go and fulfill this command. By the way, we also learn a lesson from that, and that is there is an idea that when you have a mitzvah to do, you should do it as soon as possible. Don't put off a mitzvah. We could say don't put off until later the mitzvah that you could do right now. That's why, as an example, usually a bris, a circumcision, is done early in the morning. You could do the bris anytime on the 8th day, but we usually do it in the morning because the idea, which is following the example of Abraham, is if you're given a mitzvah to do it as soon as possible. So Abraham gets up early in the morning to go to carry out this command. No protest. No protest. Now, this act that Abraham is engaged in here is, of course, the ultimate test of faith. And there is a tradition that Abraham had 10 tests. The first test was the initial command that we heard about last week, to go, to leave his home country and to go where God tells him to go. This is the last of the tests, the 10th test. And it is a test of faith, but the fact is, not only is the test here that Abraham is being asked to sacrifice his own child, but it even goes further than that. Because let's remember, what is the covenant that God made with Abraham? The covenant was, I'm going to give this land, the land of Israel, to your descendants. And your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in the heavens and the sands on the shores of the sea. Well, if Isaac dies at this point, what happens to that divine promise? What happens to the covenant that God made with Abraham? What happens to that promise? What happens to the whole relationship? What is the relationship of Abraham to God? If the promise which was made, everything is dependent on Isaac. And let's recall, of course, one could argue, well, the promise could have been fulfilled through Ishmael. After all, Abraham already has another son, Ishmael, through Sarah's maidservant Hagar. But no, it was made clear that the promise was going to be fulfilled through a child of Sarah's, through Isaac. And therefore, if Abraham goes through with this charge to sacrifice his son Isaac, then the whole future of the Jewish people is called into question, and the promise that was made to Abraham. And so really Abraham is putting everything on the line here, not only the life of his beloved son, but his relationship with God. So in order to fulfill the command of God, he's willing to put at risk the entire relationship with God, the covenant that he had entered into with God. And so this is really a test of Abraham's faith on multiple levels. Now, ultimately, what the story, I think, is really teaching is that God does not want child sacrifice. Now, it seems so bizarre to us, and it really does. It is one of these things that's a little hard to get your head around. You say, how could any parent put their child to death? I mean, it is, we would do anything to save the life of our child. How could any parent intentionally kill their child? And particularly, how could anyone do that believing that somehow it was an act of reverence for God? And yet, we know as a historical fact that in the ancient Near East, For instance, child sacrifice was a reality. The prophets in the biblical prophetic books make mention of this. They actually talk about those peoples that sacrificed their children to a god. We have the story of the king of Moab who sacrifices his son to the Moabite god in order to secure a victory over Israel. So child sacrifice was a reality. We also know in other parts of the world, we know that in Mayan culture, there was human sacrifice and indeed child sacrifice. And as a matter of fact, apparently that human sacrifice continued down into the modern era, into the 17th century. So a very strong point is being made here that the God of Israel does not want, and as a matter of fact, he abhors child sacrifice. And perhaps this story of the Akedah is the best way that that point could have been made. That God first seemingly tells Abraham, sacrifice your son. As if God does want a child sacrifice. And finally, though, he tells Abraham, no, don't do it. Don't lay a hand on him, he says. So that the act of sacrificing one's child is stopped in the process of doing it. I think that the message is given in a very strong way by presenting it like that. And then, of course, what happens is a ram which was caught by its horns in a thicket is offered up instead of Isaac. And we see there that the substitution is made, that animal sacrifice is acceptable. Animal sacrifice, of course, becomes a central ritual of Judaism during the time when the temple stood in Jerusalem. But it comes in place of child sacrifice. And ultimately, this story's message was child sacrifice is absolutely a negative. God does not want child sacrifice. And that message had to be made in a very strong way in ancient times, precisely because of the fact that child sacrifice was a reality in those cultures. And again, I think that that's also why we call this story not the sacrifice of Isaac, but the binding of Isaac. Because really all God wanted was for Abraham, in a sense, to show that he was willing to do what God commanded him to do. And so he allowed him to bind Isaac, but then he prevented him from going on any further in this act. So it's a very powerful story. It is a story that presents us with challenges, but ultimately it is a story that also teaches us of the tremendous faith that Abraham had, that he was willing to put up at risk not only his son's life, but ultimately the whole future of the relationship between the Jewish people and God. Good Shabbos.